the Manhunters. It's fun, and usually by the end of the night there would be around 8 or so of us left whose parents were particularly generous or forgetful with bedtime. And by now, even in the summer, it had started to get dark, which was obviously the best time to play Manhunt. I was the seeker this round, and it took me longer than usual to find my first sidekick. I was kind of known as the Manhunt champion in the neighborhood, and that's definitely not a brag because out of context it makes me sound like Jeffrey Dahmer. Now anyway, I found the first kid, I forget his name now, but he was acting kind of skittish and weird. And I remember he was one of those kind of larger, muscular guys even in middle school, sort of like a gentle giant. Now certainly someone who didn't get spooked easily. Matthew, I think that was his name, and this Matthew was going on about how he had seen a kid really high up in a tree, and he was kind of worried. I asked which of us it was, and he said he didn't recognize the guy at all. Apparently he looked younger, like an elementary school kid, and I joked that maybe he'd seen a monkey, and Matthew was kind of like, yeah, that's pretty much how he was sitting. And I asked if it was definitely another kid, and he said yes, for sure, because the kid even said hello to him in a sort of quiet voice. Normally in Manhunt, the hunters would split up once they'd found someone, but Matthew stuck to my side like a fly on honey, and he was so unusually jumpy. "Is that so-and-so?" he'd ask, pointing to nothing. "Is Carrie hiding over there?" toward an obviously empty bush. Now, I kept watching him, and he kept glancing up at the tree branches, too. This little kid had really spooked him, and I had no idea why a little kid, whether he was up at a tree or not, would bother big old Matthew. Now, eventually, we found a couple of more kids, and Matthew was incredibly eager to tell them about the little kid in the tree and ask if they'd seen him. They hadn't, of course, and they were naturally suspicious that me and Matthew were trying to mess with them. I assured them that I hadn't seen the kid either, and I only knew what Matthew had told me. The 2 new hunters went off scouring the forest for the remaining 4 hiders, but Matthew stuck with me. Again, he kept acting spooked and weird and jumping at little shadows here and there, and we could hear some of the other kids in the distant undergrowth, probably the 2 hiders running from the 2 seekers. Every time Matthew heard a branch crack underfoot or worse overhead, he'd sort of jump back. Eventually, I asked him why this little kid had freaked him out so much. Matthew was one of those guys who took a long time to answer, sometimes to the point that it felt like he just wasn't going to reply. Now, in the near darkness, I could see that he was working out how to explain it, though. He said that there was something wrong about the kid, like he almost looked old. And I asked him what he meant, and again he paused infuriatingly for a while, and I prompted him, "Like a Victorian child?" And Matthew said yes. But not just that. Like he was clearly a young kid, but somehow looked like an old man. I had no idea what he was trying to convey, and I was sure that he just imagined it, so we went back to seeking. Now suddenly I realized Matthew wasn't behind me. I looked, and he was some feet back, just standing there, staring. I followed his gaze, and of course he was looking up into a tree on a very high branch. "There he is," Matthew said. I was closer, and I squinted. Now, I thought I could see maybe a shape on the branch. It could have been a person, or something from a nearby tree, a clump of leaves or anything. And I asked Matthew if he could see this kid clearly, and he said, yeah, couldn't I? And I told him that no. All I could see was a sort of shadow that could have been anything, and so I started to walk toward the tree where this kid supposedly sat up in the branch, and it could have been one of the 2 remaining hiders after all. Matthew slowly but carefully darted up behind me, so silent that I hadn't even heard him. He grabbed my shoulder and told me not to come any closer. I didn't really know what to say, and I definitely couldn't clearly see this kid that Matthew was seeing, and I didn't really want to call him a lunatic. He was a gentle giant, but certain things kind of just set him off. Mental health talk was one of them, and I was alone in the woods with him, and I didn't want to start a fight with the guy on my own. Now instead, I pointed at the weird shadow that I guess could have been possibly slightly been a person, and asked Matthew if he could really clearly see this old-looking young kid up there on the branch. Matthew immediately reacted with horror. He was like, "No," and pointed to a different branch, one I hadn't looked at. I had to stifle a small scream and jump back in horror, as Matthew was right. This weird little kid was sitting on a branch a good 20 feet in the air, and he, I think it was a he, was staring at us with kind of sad eyes, and I saw exactly what Matthew meant about him looking old. He was clearly an elementary school kid, but his eyes looked ancient, like he'd seen some stuff. And the kid said hello, shyly, and then he asked if he could play with us, and he was wearing what looked like pajamas, but old-style ones, sort of like a nightgown, and I'm pretty sure he had bare feet. I barely mumbled out a reply, saying that we just about finished our game now, but we played Manhunt most days, so if he came and found us earlier on the ground and introduced himself, then he was welcome to join in. And the kid just looked at us for a while, clearly saddened, and then just said, "Oh, okay." And then the weird little dude scrambled along the branch behind the tree trunk, and that was the last we saw of him. Ever. Now, one final thing, as he disappeared behind that tree trunk, I could have sworn, absolutely sworn, that his sad young little face transformed into a brief grimace of the most hateful anger I'd ever had directed my way. I told Matthew that we should get out of there, and thankfully the other two seekers had found the other two hiders, so we all went home. None of us mentioned the little kid in the tree again, and we never heard anything about any hauntings in that forest, or dead kids, or kids going missing, and there was no town, urban legend that it could have related to. Maybe he really was just a weird little elementary schooler, lonely and looking to play with the big kids. But if that was the case, I just have two questions. Why did he freak Matthew out so bad? And why, when I looked at him, was I certain that I could see the leaves in the forest behind him just slightly through his body, as if he wasn't entirely corporeal? Back in 2007, I was a fire investigator for a large paid fire department. We had a 4-alarm fire at a group of 6 large buildings that were built in the early 1900s. Heavy timber and brick construction, with each being 7 to 9 stories tall. For years, the floors were cleaned with an oil-based chemical, so these buildings were essentially one big matchstick, and the fire came in at around 2 in the morning. The fire was stopped after it destroyed 3 of the 6 buildings, and later in the afternoon, we, the investigators, were having a meeting on site when a captain from one of the engines came up to us and said that when he was looking for a fire extension in the 4th building, he heard, as he described, several blood-curdling screams coming from what he thought was the basement area. He said the water was too deep, and with limited lighting he was unable to do a complete search of the area. And by the next day, we knew the water would have drained out of the building, so I volunteered to go check it out, me, myself, and a big flashlight. I entered from street level, which was actually the 3rd floor with a sub-basement, and then the basement itself, so 5 floors to go down. Where the light from my flashlight was not focused on, it was a total blacked-out environment. I couldn't see my hand right in front of my own face. No sound other than my breathing and the creaking and popping of the old wooden stairwell that I was climbing down. Firefighting is a pitch-black job for the most part, so I wasn't freaking out about the lack of lighting. When I reached the sub-basement level, I heard a distinct male voice say, "Stop. Don't go any further." It came from further down the stairs. No, it wasn't demonic sounding. It was just a male's deep voice, maybe a little gruff. I hesitated, thinking my mind was actually playing tricks on me, and I shone my flashlight down the steps, but the floors were roughly 20 feet apart, so I couldn't really see the next landing, and there was a landing at each floor's fire door and another halfway between. I was between the sub-basement landing and the next halfway landing when this happened, so technically I should have been able to see at least the outline of the next landing, but my flashlight's glow was just eaten up by the darkness. I remember I took 2 more steps down, and then my heart skipped a beat, or probably beats, because in a more forceful and louder voice it said, "Stop." It wasn't some quick stop, it was sort of drawn out, a very matter-of-fact stop. And that did it for me. I turned around and started making my way back up to the level I came in on. Now, I'll be the first to say that I was finally scared and doing a little full-body shaking because I couldn't go fast because I had to visualize each and every step with my flashlight's glow. I finally made it back into the beautiful sunshine and told my chief that it was just too dark to adequately do a search. I wasn't about to tell him about the voice. He probably would have told me that I was nuts. Now, later that week, we had to have that building demolished, and once the debris was removed down to the basement level, we ran a cadaver dog over the area and it hit on nothing. And then, just to say that we covered all the bases, we then had a forensic team come in and go through that area, and they found nothing. Now, I'm not sure how you would classify this type of occurrence, but I'll go to my grave knowing what I heard. Do any of you guys remember the board game Mousetrap? I think it's still around probably, and it feels like one of those games everyone had growing up, and I kind of want to believe it's still around now. Now, Google says it still is, and the mice look majorly different though, but the diver piece seems to be exactly the same. Now, this is relevant because the diver from Mousetrap is kind of the subject of my weird childhood experience. And so for the 3 people who don't know what it is, Mousetrap is a board game where you essentially work together to build a Rube Goldberg-type machine, and then in endgame you compete with each other to trap each other's mice. It's really fun. It's a tactile game, and building the crazy Mousetrap used to be a real hoot. Now, I won't explain the whole thing, but one of the aspects of the machine involves a diver being catapulted into a bucket. So in the old copy me and my siblings had, the diver was green, and the way the model is designed, it looks like he's about to dive, obviously, but that also means that his hands are in a praying position. My siblings and I loved board games. It was back in the 80s, so the choice for little kids seemed completely endless. We loved board games and those Tiger LCD handheld video games. Do you guys remember those? I had an absolutely freaking fantastic Top Gun one. Highway to the Danger Zone, baby. Except it was more like the bleep bloop bleep bleep type. But our imaginations filled in the gaps with all these games, and electronic or board, and the board games about haunted houses or creepy swamps really transported us to those locations. Mousetrap really turned us into mad scientists and mice, at the same time, I guess. And then as we got older, we played things like Hero Quest, Catan, Risk, but we still played Mousetrap, even when some of us were in our early/mid-teens, because it was just timeless. There were 4 of us siblings. I was the second eldest, but the eldest was our sister Lisa. She was the one who bought the new board game that changed it all, the Ouija board. Now, this isn't one of those stories, I promise. In fact, it's kind of significant that we never even used the Ouija board, but its presence definitely did cause a creepy incident. And so Lisa bought the Ouija board, and the rest of us were all hyped up to play it one night. Maybe the next time our parents went out overnight on a date night, and Lisa was entrusted with the care of the rest of us. Now, that wouldn't be for a few weeks, though, so the Ouija board box got put in the board game cupboard right on top of the Mousetrap box. And so the board game cupboard was downstairs in the family living room. Now, one night, our parents were out for an hour or so, and I was upstairs playing Nintendo with my younger brother Kevin when we heard a weird sort of whistling sound coming from downstairs. I don't know how to describe it, but we both sort of looked at each other with this unspoken understanding that this sound was something creepy. I don't actually remember the sound to describe it now, other than that it sounded unnatural somehow. We went downstairs, and our youngest sibling, Claire, was in the kitchen. She was a lot younger than the rest of us, just 6 years old at the time, and Kevin and I checked on her, and she asked if we heard the weird scream. She said it came from the living room, and her bottom lip was kind of trembling like it had really spooked her. We went into that room, and the only thing that seemed out of place was the board game cupboard. One of the doors was open slightly, and it was the kind of cupboard that closed magnetically, so this was definitely weird. Lisa joined us in that living room and asked what was up, and she said that she hadn't heard the sound because she was listening to her Walkman. Now, we opened the board game cupboard, and the Mousetrap game was kind of sticking out. It's hard to explain, but it was obvious that whatever weirdness was going on involved that. We got the box out and opened it, and I wasn't immediately clear what had happened at first, but then Kevin noticed it. The diver figurine's praying hands had been cut clean off, seemingly by a scalpel because of how smooth and perfect the cut was. Now, of course, one of us had to have done it. It wasn't Kevin, because he had been with me. I don't know why it could have been Claire since she was so young, and the only slightly realistic suspect was Lisa, but to this day she swears it wasn't her. Now, I said something like, I guess the diver can't pray anymore, and we had a sort of running joke that he was praying for the mice and kind of thought no more of it. Now, fast forward many years later. Our parents have now both sadly passed away, and it came down to me, Claire, and Lisa to clear out our old family home and go through their things. Kevin lives abroad and unfortunately couldn't make it back. When we were going through the board game cupboard, me or Lisa, I forget who, but one of us brought up the weird incident with the diver's hands. We sort of speculated about why we hadn't investigated the incident further, and we argued about whether we maybe did. All the board games were exactly how we left them, and I realized that we hadn't actually played Mousetrap since the diver incident, so it just sort of sat there on top of the Ouija board box, which we'd also never actually used. I can't remember if this was a conscious decision or not. Either way, Lisa pulled out both boxes, and sure enough, the diver was still handless, no longer able to pray for the mice. I'm not sure why we expected anything else. What I didn't expect, though, was what we found when Lisa opened the box to the Ouija board. She was curious if it was still in good condition, having been the one to buy it back in the day and then never touch it. The usual components were there: the board, the planchette, a pencil and a notepad paper so players could write down the messages from the beyond. But also sitting in the box was a single piece of green plastic. 2 hands cast in the position of praying. Clearly the hands had been sliced from the Mousetrap diver, just sitting there in the Ouija board box as far as I knew, and we had never opened or let alone played it. There's still the possibility that Lisa did this as a sort of prank, or that Claire did it for some bizarre childhood reason. Both of them swear on God's name that they don't remember setting up this prank, though, and we kind of moved on from it too quickly, in my opinion. If it had been a prank, one of us would have tried harder to freak the others out, and it was only now that we were freaked out, though. That strange sound that we heard that day, the diver's praying hands being severed, and the hands being clearly placed in the Ouija board's box. Our father, who'd passed away most recently and whose death had led us to clearing out the house, had died on that property, and we all agreed to dispose of the Ouija board and the Mousetrap box, no matter whether it was a prank or supernatural, just in case some bad juju caused any harm to Dad's spirit in the afterlife. Maybe this doesn't seem scary to some, but to me, there is no explanation for why the diver's praying hands were cut off and why we didn't investigate further. My theory is that some dark presence lingered in the house and would have been unleashed if we'd played around with that Ouija board. Now, I think the whole series of events stopped us from doing so and maybe prevented my family from getting truly haunted. In many ways, that's reassuring. But it makes me wonder what kind of force could have been so dark and threatening that another supernatural force would step in and warn us in whatever weird way it was able. Claire had the idea to burn sage in the house, and we did so after ensuring that that Mousetrap and the Ouija board had been carted away by the garbage men. We didn't tell Kevin about the incident. He was the skeptic among us, and he would have laughed at us. There are a whole bunch of other reasons relating to my family, too, that cause me to believe this, but it'd turn into a novel if I listed them all. But I am convinced that some benevolent force was looking out for us that day by trying to illustrate the fact that the Ouija board would block any kind of holy blessing or maybe even prayer inside our house. Make of it what you will. I'm just very glad that we never went ahead and played with that Ouija board anyway. Now, I never posted anything on here before, but I'm at a loss for words this morning. Now, let me start this out by saying my son does not watch graphic television shows, nothing violent, and he's a dinosaur-loving kid and mostly watching Land Before Time and the occasional Jurassic Park or Jurassic World movies with me and my fiancé, who's a 31-year-old male. Now, we recently just bought our house, about 2 months ago now, and I started to notice little things, but nothing that was sounding any sort of warning bells. I've lived in haunted houses before, so I just went on with my day and essentially ignored it until one night at around 11:30, I heard whistling. Now, I live in the Appalachians, so whistling at night is a big no-no in my house, so I call out to my fiancé and tell him to stop whistling in the house. It will invite weird spirits in. He comes into our bedroom and I said to him, "Why the hell are you whistling at night?" And he goes pale and says, I'm not whistling. And I'm thinking he's messing with me, so I just say, yeah, okay, and go to bed. Now, the next morning I'm in the shower and he comes in and says, be honest with me. Were you pranking me last night? And I, of course, tell him everything that happened and assure him that I was not pranking him. He is a skeptic and always has been, and he again goes pale and just says, okay, and drops it. Nothing happened for about 2 weeks until 3 nights ago I was on a phone call with my cousin and heard a loud crash. My fiancée works night shift, so I immediately go into protector mode and assume someone was breaking in. That's how loud it was. I'm still on the phone with my cousin and she is witnessing everything that's happening. I call out asking if anyone is there. Now, I know, I'd be the first one killed in a horror movie, but if someone is in my house, I wanted them to know that I was coming and not afraid, even though I clearly was. I get to the bottom of the stairs and at first I see nothing, so I'm starting to feel less on edge until I walk out into my kitchen. I notice a candle, one of those 3-wick ones that you can buy at Walmart, halfway across the room. I look at the entry table where I had it sitting, and a painting I also keep there was knocked over. So my first thought was, okay, the house was settling and it just knocked the candle over, no big deal. I picked everything up and set it back where I had it, though I thought it was strange that it mysteriously fell over, especially since I have a 4-year-old who runs all over the house all the time and the vibration from that hasn't knocked it off. And so I decided that I'd test to see what it would take to make it fall. I'm running, jumping, doing everything I can to try and get it to fall the way it did, and it's not budging. I even hit the table and it still didn't fall. And so of course I'm a little spooked but decided to just go to bed. Last night as I'm falling asleep, I heard loud banging coming from downstairs. Of course my fiancé is working again, so I have to go down and check it out for myself. I go down and get a very unsettling feeling. All of the hairs on my body are standing up and I feel like I'm being watched. I don't know what came over me, but I just said out loud, I don't care that you're here, but please stop doing the things when I'm home alone, okay? And then turned to walk up the stairs. Now, you know that feeling where you have to run up the stairs because it feels like something's chasing you? That's the feeling I get. I turn around and say it's enough and that I will not be scared in my own home and walk to my bedroom. I continue to hear things during the night and my cat is very on edge. She's acting as if she was guarding my bedroom door. Now, about an hour later, at around 1 a.m., my son wakes up and asks if I will turn a movie on for him so he can fall back asleep, and so I do. Instead, I hear him mumbling in his room as if he's talking to somebody. Now, this is not abnormal for him, as he has a very big imagination and loves playing and coming up with his own worlds, creating stories for them as he goes. Now, about an hour ago, he's sitting with me and looks at me with a straight face and says, Mommy, my ghost brother says I have to kill you. But I would never do that because I love you so much. Now I'm completely in shock and say to him, What did you just say? And he repeated it. And I then prodded, asking for more information. And he's been going through this phase where he's been more defiant, but again, he's 4, so I don't think anything of it. But he tells me his ghost brother tells him to break toys, hurt animals, stomp on flowers he wants to pick for me, etc. Now my son is very kind and very empathetic, and him saying all of this to me is very out of character for him. He's the child who won't kill a bug because what if they have a family and they miss them? That kind of little boy, so I'm in complete shock. I'm not sure if this is a made-up fantasy for him or if I should actually be concerned. And I come from a long line of people sensitive to the paranormal, so experiences are something I'm very familiar with, but not to this caliber. And I'm also worried for my son's safety and well-being, especially if it's something I cannot see to protect him from. If anyone has any advice, please tell me. Hey Joel, have you seen It, Welcome to Derry, the show yet? At the time of writing, I think there are 3 episodes out and it's really good, but it reminded me of a majorly creepy story that happened to me back in the early 2000s. I had been apartment hunting for what felt like forever. Now, finding an apartment wasn't the issue. The issue was Gizmo, my 3-year-old black cat, and I could not for the life of me find an apartment that would let me bring a pet cat. And there was absolutely no way on God's green earth that I was giving Gizmo up for adoption and moving anywhere without him, and so I spent an entire year living back in my childhood bedroom, all the while Mom acted a little too excited that her beloved daughter had come home to roost, quote-unquote. I adore my mom. Well, technically she's my stepmom and my dad, but after going away to college and then living in a pet-friendly apartment with Gizmo for nearly 3 years, I absolutely needed my own space. And so I didn't want Mom getting too used to the idea of me living back at home. Eventually, I found the perfect place. I waited for the catch that they wouldn't allow pets, but when I asked, the landlady invited me into her own apartment and introduced me to her 6 feline babies, and at that point, everything was perfect. I moved in as soon as possible and I didn't have too many belongings, and I think the most delicate item I owned was Gizmo's huge climbing tree that I bought for him, and I oversaw the moving guys handling that with more care than I did my own damn television or couch. Man, I spoiled that cat. But he deserved it, though. Rest in peace, Gizmo, you were the best of them, and he lived to the ripe old age of 18 and passed away peacefully, but our years together were absolutely wonderful. And then there was this one incident, though. In my bedroom in my apartment was an air vent grate for the air conditioner or something, and there was a very formal sticker on the grate saying that it was not to be covered up or have anything placed in front of it. So as a good little tenant who didn't want to be booted back home again, I left that ugly vent visible. Now, this was only a problem because Gizmo was obsessed with it. That cat would sit in front of that vent for hours and hours at a time. Occasionally he'd let out a little mew or gently swipe at it, but mostly he'd just stare. I was beginning to feel a little bit neglected by my pet, and he was more interested in the damn vent than he was in me. Still, as you know, that's cats for you, and then I realized maybe this meant that there was a mouse or a less palatable rodent that he could just actually smell in that vent. Now, I contacted the landlady, who was very understanding and, as a cat owner, trusted Gizmo's judgment implicitly, and so she called an exterminator to check out the vents for any evidence of rodent activity. Nothing. Not a thing. Completely flawless. Best-kept ventilation system the guy had ever seen, apparently. And so, whatever. My cat was obsessed with the air vent, but he'd get over it. Now, I was sort of right. Gizmo spent less time staring at the vent and more time allowing me to pet him and playing on his climbing tree. And did I mention how ridiculously expensive that climbing tree was? Well, it was, so I was relieved when he finally started playing on it again. Occasionally, I'd still catch him staring at the vent, though, and I'll admit, knowing it wasn't rodents or anything did kind of freak me out a little. Nothing too bad, though, until that one night. I woke up in the middle of the night. Everything was pitch black, but I could hear voices and music coming faintly from the next room, the living room. Now, pretty obviously, the TV was turned on. I didn't remember leaving it on when I went to bed, as I had a glass of wine or two, but I wasn't exactly drunk. I stood up to walk into the next room, and on instinct, really, I glanced at the vent to see if Gizmo was sitting there staring at it, and he was not. But for a split second, I swear on every expensive piece of technology I have that I saw 2 red, glowing dots peering out of that vent. Now I shifted slightly and they were gone. A reflection on the metal from the LED on some devices, maybe. Probably. But of course they looked like eyes. Red eyes glowing from the goddamn floor vent. And so I went into the other room. Gizmo was lying on the couch, awkwardly smushed against the remote control, and had clearly somehow managed to turn the TV on by sleeping on the remote. I looked at the screen. The 90s It movie was playing. You know the one, the Tim Curry one. And at that exact moment, it was the scene where Pennywise is looking out the sewer calling Georgie over, trying to lure him in. And at one point in that whole sequence, you can see Pennywise's eyes glowing from a floor-level pitch-black gap. Immediately, my mind shot back to that vent. I got chills in places I didn't even know existed, and I turned into the living room light and my bedroom light and then switched the channel to an episode of Frasier. No late-night horror movies for me, I thought. Now, one final thing the next day, I decided that I didn't care what the sticker said, and I placed a large clothing hamper that I use for storage in front of the vent, and that is where it stayed until my lease was up. The landlady was surprised that I neglected to renew the lease after such a short period of time, and I felt really bad. But after that experience, I genuinely started to develop a fear of the dark, not to mention the floor vents. Sure, it meant moving back into my parents again, but at least there was no creepy, potentially haunted vent to deal with. Now, I'm sure I'm an idiot, and I threw away the best apartment rental of my life because I saw a trick of the light. But one thing I learned in my subsequent years with Gizmo is this: always trust your animal's instincts. They're always right, and in this case, who knows what he saved me from. This story happened to my parents when they were in their early 20s. Mom recounted this story to me, and she is absolutely not one for making things up or embellishing them. And even despite the experience I'm about to describe, she doesn't really believe in the paranormal. And when I ask her to explain it, she just goes quiet, and I feel bad about pressing her on it. And so here's what happened. She and my dad, still engaged at the time, were driving home from a party right out in the middle of nowhere. We live in a countryside town, so there are a lot of properties just out in the sticks, accessible only via winding forest roads, none of which have any real lighting or safety measures, especially back then. Now, Dad was a bit of a gearhead back in the day, proper into his cars, and he would have been into motorbikes too, but Mom had always forbidden him from getting into that. Now anyway, Dad would take any opportunity he could to put the pedal to the metal and put whatever junker car he'd gotten his hands on lately to the test. And they might not have been expensive, beautiful sports cars or anything like that, but he just loved the act of driving. And back then, the idea of speed cameras was barely a thing, and certainly not on the winding country roads. So Dad's kind of barreling down these fairly wide, decently maintained yet remote roads. There are some long straights and some hairpin bends, and I've since been on the road that they were talking about, and there's a thick forest leading downward on one side and a mountainous hill on the other. They would have been on the mountainside, with Mum as the passenger closest to the mountain. Now remember, we drive on the left here with a steering wheel on the right, so she was basically riding blind. Dad was being a bit of a lad and showing off, speeding a bit. And then suddenly Mom got this feeling, like this very dark, intense feeling in her chest, and as calmly but firmly as she could, she told Dad to drop his speed almost to nothing. Now, for whatever reason, he took her seriously pretty much immediately. Mum said that there was something blocking the road around the curve of the mountain. Dad asked how she knew because she couldn't possibly see that part of the road. She said it was about 5 minutes ahead and that she just had this vision of spikes in the road. And so Dad started to drive along this huge curve at around 30 miles per hour until they got to a point where they could see that Mum was right. There very much was something in the road. It was a stag. A huge, majestic stag just standing there in the center of the left side of the road, staring straight forward. If they had hit that stag at the speed that they were going, it would have almost certainly killed both of them and the stag. To this day, Mum cannot or will not explain how she had this sort of premonition. She says nothing like that has ever happened again, but from the way she says it, I'm not sure I believe her. What I do believe her about is this, though. Dad swears blind it happened too, and when I was younger, when they first told me the story, they took me out to the road where it happened, and I felt this chill exactly around the spot that the stag would have been. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like a sort of ghostly feeling that I could sense related to my parents, almost like this is where they would have died, and you wouldn't have existed. Now, this is one of those stories that I genuinely don't care if people believe or not. Even though I wasn't there personally, it happened, and to me, it makes me wonder how many other messages and warnings we get throughout our lives that we instinctively act upon without even realizing it. Now, I'm not going to start a theological or quantum physics debate about what any of this could mean, but I do know one thing. I'm glad that my dad's the kind of person who can be bossed around by my mum, because that day, if he hadn't immediately obeyed her there, the events that followed would mean I wouldn't have been born. When we were younger, my sister, who's like 7 years younger than me, had an imaginary friend. I'd never had one, so it was kind of novel to hear my baby sister talking about this imaginary, invisible thing. And I remember asking Mom who Shani was talking to at first. And I don't know why I didn't ask my sister directly. I probably did, and she gave some infuriating baby answer. Love you, sis. Now anyway, Mom explained the concept of imaginary friends to me and told me that it was totally normal for most children to have them. She said that she was surprised that I never had one and maybe I still would. And then she told me about her own imaginary friend, Mr. T. Hungry, who was a big, cuddly caterpillar. Now I found this hilarious. Naturally, I became curious as to who or what my sister Shani's imaginary friend was. Shani was 4 and I was only 10, so I still didn't quite grasp the concept. In my head, they were imaginary but real, if that makes sense. Like they get assigned to a kid and they exist for that kid, as opposed to the kid just totally making the character up. I didn't entirely grasp the idea that your imaginary friend could just be anyone. And so the way I saw it, I wanted to discover what kind of person or thing my sister Shani had been assigned. I soon discovered that Shani's first imaginary friend was a giant fluffy version of Jar Jar Binks from Star Wars, but a girl called Wobble Eyes. And this seemed really lame to me, but it was kind of funny listening to my sister try and talk back in Jar Jar speak. And it became clear that Shani was kind of special. She's an absolute genius, but she's spacey, and even to this day she likes to talk aloud to imaginary constructs as a way to process information and get things straight in her head. Now, she did this from a young age, although back then it was unfortunately dismissed as slow development, and it meant that Shani had a number of imaginary friends over the years, though, continuing on a little older than with other kids. The friends did become more grounded, though, and as she got older, it seemed like she was just talking to other invisible kids roughly her age. Eventually, I kinda tuned it out because Random Imaginary Boy is a lot less interesting than Inside Out Slug Trapeze Artist or something. Now, I was 16, just starting junior year. Shani was 9. She still had an imaginary friend, though, and like I said, I'd learned to tune them out, but one day, I overheard a one-sided conversation through the adjoining vents between our rooms that I just couldn't ignore. Now, she was asking an imaginary friend how she died, and I realized the answer was a car accident. And as they spoke for longer, it became clear from what Shani was saying that she apparently knew about this car accident and remembered it upsetting the town, quote-unquote, and upsetting Millie, that's me. Here's the thing. I did have a friend who died in a car accident when I was in freshman year, and obviously it upset me. But it also upset the town because this friend, her name was Greta, was only 14 and she was out joyriding with a couple of senior boys, all of whom were drunk. Needless to say, there was a crash. Greta came out of it dead, and due to who the driver's family was, it created this big drama within town. Now, it kind of made sense that Shani would have internalized details about Greta. She'd met her before, and she knew that I was pretty cut up when she passed away. Now, a part of me was kind of mad that she adopted Greta as an imaginary friend, but then a part of me kind of was curious and open to the occult as a junior. A part of me didn't want to dismiss this idea as a simple imaginary friend. So, as gently as I could, because Shani could be a little volatile back then. Now, she is a listener, so she might hear this, but hey, you said I'm allowed to post it. Now anyways, as gently as I could, I started asking Shani questions about Greta. Like, what did she look like? And Shani didn't know because she couldn't see all of her imaginary friends, just some of them. And I told her to ask a few certain questions, and sure enough, it was pretty obvious it was Greta that she was talking about. Now again, she was probably just internalizing and processing her death, though, even though it was kind of weird that it was 2 years later. Now what was even weirder, though, was that shortly after all this kicked off, the passenger in the car, who had been the one dating Greta at the time, despite being 18, tried to take a certain drastic action against himself. Now, trying to use YouTube's necessary baby language here, he never faced legal consequences for the whole thing and wasn't the most popular around town because of it, but this whole incident came out of absolutely nowhere. It kind of spooked me, but also intrigued me, and a few of us tried a couple of different seances a few times to contact Greta ourselves. Nothing happened, of course, though. However, I did keep seeing a shadow in the corner of my eye, and it became more and more persistent and was starting to freak me out. And then I noticed that I never once saw this shadow when Shani was having a conversation with Greta. If Shani was playing or not, or talking to another imaginary friend, though, then I constantly found myself looking over my shoulder or sensing a presence behind me. One night, I woke up to grab a drink, and I paused in the middle of my room because I was so 100% certain that someone was standing behind me with their hand just about to touch my shoulder. I was genuinely too scared to move for almost an entire minute, and then the feeling went away, and I felt safe to move again. When I got back to my room, I felt this weird, cold exhaustion, and I spoke aloud and just said, "Greta, I miss you. I'll never forget you, and I don't judge you." And that's the last thing I remember before falling asleep. Now, the next day, Shani knocked on my bedroom door. Now, she told me shyly that she'd been asked to tell me that Greta had gone home now, and then she turned away and ran. Now, I followed her, but she ran right outside to go play with her friends, and I didn't want to look like a weirdo, being the aloof emo kid who tries to hang out with 9-year-olds. I don't need to tell you that the shadows and the feelings of being watched, the strange sensations, they went away after that. And to this day, I have no idea if I was just processing my grief late and that somehow manifested in Shani or vice versa or what. Shani, who is the most rational person I know, insists that it was not Greta's ghost and I'm misremembering or rewriting the story to be more supernatural in my head. But I know I'm not. And that doesn't mean it was supernatural, but I certainly think that there's a chance that it was. But what do you guys think? Now, one more thing before I go I'm going to add is the other passenger in the car who took drastic action, he strongly found religion literally within the month of Greta supposedly going home and has turned his life around in maybe the biggest way I've ever seen. And so again, I ask, what do you guys think? This is one of those stories that I'm incredibly frustrated that I didn't pay more attention to when it happened. I was a tiny little kid, and if I'd been just a bit older, I could have an entire scrapbook about this damn occurrence. Now, I could probably sell the movie rights and throw a few lines in there and end up with something like the Amityville Horror or The Conjuring 2, although I'm pretty sure the events of The Conjuring 2, the Enfield Council House, were directly proven to be a scam, and they conveniently left that out of the movie. Now, I don't think mine's a scam, but I'm also not sure I believe it, even though it happened to me, and that's what makes it weird, I guess. So all the memories of this came flooding back when I was at work one day. A customer came in, an elderly lady, and asked me, "Hey, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you Joe Fabulous?" Now, obviously, that's not my real name. I'm just not about to dox myself here. And I said that yes, in fact, I am Joe Fabulous. Why? And then I suddenly realized that she was my old-ass English teacher in elementary school. And so I assumed that she recognized me and wanted to catch up. But no. I started to say that she was my elementary school teacher, right? And then she responds, "Yeah, I guess I was." So that's why it stuck with me. "But you were the kids whose house was in the local paper, weren't you?" And for a minute I'm thinking, huh? What? And then suddenly I remembered. Like this eureka moment. Yeah, our house had been in the local paper for some goddamn reason when I was a little kid, and that reason was because it was allegedly haunted. The old lady asked how I was doing, and before I could even finish answering, she was asking about the house, if I had any insights to share that weren't in the newspapers. Now, I was like my grandma. I was 5 years old and I don't remember anything. But I said it more politely, obviously, and she seemed disappointed, and then asked if the house was still haunted and if we still experienced satanic goings-on. Now, I had to explain to her that I was 30 years old and we'd lived in that house when I was 5 and moved out when I was 6, so sorry, I had no idea if it was still haunted, but I'm not sure if it was ever haunted to begin with. Now, this old lady reached out and put a hand on my arm and looked at me with real pity. She told me that I was too young to remember, but the house was definitely haunted because it had been in the paper, and that if I was still in touch with my mom, I should ask her about it because maybe I wasn't doing enough to protect myself, spiritually now. Now, this all went well over my head, so I tried to just politely get rid of this clearly crazy old lady as quick as possible. But she had been correct about our old house being weirdly in the newspaper when I was a little kid because it was supposedly haunted, and I figured it was one of those things where local papers were still looking for the next Amityville house or Enfield poltergeist, and so anyone could go to the papers and say their chairs had been moved around or whatever. And maybe that's what my mom had done, although that didn't really seem like her. And so the next time I saw my mom, I asked her about it, and she reminded me of the whole weird affair. Now back then, it was me, my 2 older sisters, and one of my younger sisters, and the last one hadn't been born yet, and according to Mom, we all started noticing obvious ghost activity around the house. We'd come home from an evening out, and some of the pictures had been hung upside down. A crucifix kept falling off the wall. My youngest sister, who was prone to extreme imagination, I gotta be honest, claimed that she saw a black girl crouching on top of her wardrobe. Now, Mom was quick to explain that apparently this meant that the girl was covered in soot or smoke or something and not just some random black chick crawling around our house. And so my mom, who's a rational, no-nonsense woman, somehow managed to get persuaded by one of her friends to call in a local priest who did ghost cleansing, for a fee, of course. Now, he agreed to bring his team at a discount in if we allowed the local press to come as well. Obviously, it was a big hustle, and they were psyching my mom and stepdad up to believe that just some random, unexplained everyday occurrences were paranormal activity. And so, from what I can remember as a tiny kid and what Mom explained, this priest, I'm not sure if he was an ordained priest, came with a team of backup guys and the 2 members of the local press, a journalist and a photographer. All these guys, Mom, stepdad, and my eldest sister, then performed a seance together in the living room, where the dark spiritual energy was the, quote, most concentrated apparently. Now after that, the priest declared that he had cleansed the house, and the local paper got a feel-good, "we have exorcised the demons" story out of it, including a photograph with a weird smear over Mom's head that was definitely a ghost photo according to the paper. And apparently this is the newspaper article that my old elementary school teacher remembered so thoroughly all those years later. So, it was just a scam? I said to my mom, expecting her to laugh it off and admit that, yeah, we'd been dragged into the hysteria surrounding haunted houses back then. But her face took a very dark turn, and she asked if I really didn't remember the rest. I said no, and she told me that after the seance and the newspaper article, that's when things actually got bad. Pictures would not only be found upside down, but with their glass cracked. We'd come home, with nobody in the house, and find the chairs had been knocked over. And there were all these things that you couldn't conclusively prove as paranormal activity. We lived near a railway, so maybe that was like causing all this random destruction, I'm not sure. But that didn't explain the nightmares my sister started having, though. And that didn't explain the night when my youngest sister woke my mom and stepdad up to tell them that we shouldn't have invited the paper men into the house because we've made people angry. And it didn't explain the dream my mom had when she was pregnant with my final sister, in which she gave birth to a demon. Now, we moved out of that house and never spoke of it again. Mom did her best to avoid bringing it up with the kids, and our stepdad at the time was 2 stepdads ago, so who knows what he's up to now. And he wasn't the nicest man, so if anyone was a conduit for dark paranormal energy, it was him. He wasn't the father of our youngest sister, and he'd already left by then. And even though we spent a while living in a couple of ratty-ass broken-down apartments before we found somewhere nicer that matched the haunted house in quality, Mom says that she does not regret getting us out of there. Me, I remember none of it, and as far as I'm concerned, someone tried to set my family up as a cash cow for a Conjuring-style movie. But my mom and older sisters seemed to get pretty angry with me when I suggested this. Now, they tell me I should just take things of this nature more seriously. And maybe they're right. Maybe haunted houses do exist, and they're just not the ones that get movies made about them, and they're not the ones with embellished details. They're just inhabited by beings that are quietly, patiently evil, waiting for the right family to move in with whom they can have their fun. When it comes to dark, trippy folk music from the 60s, there was very few artists that matched the talent, diversity, and prolific nature of Donovan Phillips Leach, aka Donovan. Now, he was about 50 million songs out now, and most of which the average person won't even know. But if you haven't heard Hurdy-Gurdy Man, then I'd be very surprised. But more than that, his most famous song by far, a song used in a million movies and horror shows and just about anything that involves witches, is the seminal Season of the Witch from his incredible 1966 album Sunshine Superman. Now, I know I sound like Patrick Bateman here, but Donovan manages to be one of the most rare artists whose music is chill and trippy, but also completely creepy and inexplicably formative at the same time. Yeah, if you can't tell, I freaking love Donovan, and I wasn't even born during his heyday. Now, he had some success over in the UK, but it was Sunshine Superman that really grabbed the attention of America, landing a #1 spot in the top 10 Billboard for a week. Now, if you read this, Joel, either pause the video or wait till you're done and then go listen to Season of the Witch. I 100% guarantee that you've heard it before. The reason I keep mentioning this song in particular is because it's the subject of the extremely spooky story I have to share. Now, my dad told me this story first, but it was his dad's story. An old chill hippie who loves telling me stories that are always upbeat, positive, and cheerful. And I really had to push him to tell me the story, but I'm glad I did because it kicked off my lifetime obsession with haunted music and the study of satanic panic around rock and roll and various other deeper audio-related horror mysteries. Now, this is a bit of a personal one, though. So it was 1967, and Grandpa had finally saved up enough of his tips from his paperboy job to buy a copy of Sunshine Superman. He'd heard the singles Sunshine Superman and Season of the Witch on the radio and absolutely loved them, so he had to get it. And when he did, though, and brought it home and stuck it on the family's record player, he was a little horrified. The record played fine, but whenever it got to Season of the Witch, in multiple places where Donovan sings, "Must be the season of the witch," there was an audible skip in the record, and instead it sounded like he was saying, "Must be Satan." Now, his parents, who were fairly relaxed folk, were unhappy with this, and he convinced them that the song wasn't meant to sound this way, and he also had a couple of friends listen with him to prove that he wasn't going mad. Now, the weird thing was, there was no noticeable scratch on the record, so he cycled over to his buddy Jimmy's place, record under his arm, and then played it there. And the song sounded absolutely fine. And then he took it back to the store that he'd bought it from, and again, the song did not skip. And so Grandpa invested some money in a head cleaner and some new needles for the family record player, and it did nothing. Now, when he played it on his home record, Donovan sang, "Must be Satan." Now, Grandpa started imagining this witch who was in the sway of Satan, and it started infecting his daydreams. At first, he couldn't listen to the track, but then, whenever he put the album on itself, he started picturing this satanic old woman. In the end, Jimmy offered to take it off his hands for a small fee. Grandpa just gave it to him and said that it was his to keep, but made him promise that he'd melt the thing down if it started to actually say Satan. Once Jimmy had the record, it was fine. Grandpa loved Donovan's next release, Mellow Yellow, but to this day he refuses to listen to Sunshine Superman. If Season of the Witch comes on during the many movies and TV shows it gets featured on, he'll mute it or change the channel. Hearing the story from my grandpa's rich, calm, old hippie voice gave me the chills, and I still love Donovan myself, as does my dad, and I personally never had a satanic experience with Season of the Witch, but it is a creepy song, and I can't help but think of the story when I listen to it. Unlike many of the other urban legends, like playing things in reverse and Jimmy Page's shed and all sorts of things, I've never found anything else ever about "Must be Satan," and I can't explain it, and frankly, I don't think I want to. Big fan of the channel, and I've been listening for what seems like forever, and I got a bit of a weird, creepy story for you. Now, I know you don't run paranormal stories very often, but I'm almost 99% sure that this is a paranormal story, so it's up to you if you run it or not, and I'd love it if you did. So I was a really little kid when this happened. My parents were going through a pretty nasty divorce, although I didn't know this at the time, obviously, and all I knew is that Mommy and Daddy had a lot of things going on, and that they would always both love me, even if they didn't love each other in the same way anymore. In reality, they were engaged in an absolutely grueling court case with all sorts of nastiness, but we won't get into all of that. Anyway, as far as I was concerned, this meant that I got to stay at Nona and Grandpa's house for the summer, which I loved. The house was old, creepy, and filled with dark corners and strange decorations. Now, there were at least two grandfather clocks and portraits of people I like to make up stories about, and there were rooms that were locked and rooms that I was told not to go into. There was an attic that I was allowed into, but I was too afraid to even head up there until I got a bit older. There was a library filled with books that made me think Nona and Grandpa must be geniuses, and there was stuffed birds and a deer's head on one wall. And in short, it was the absolute perfect house for creepy, weird little kid like me. And not that I was creepy and weird in a bad way. I was just into horror comics, Goosebumps, and horror toys and all that kind of stuff. You get it. I was a spooky little boy, and so I loved going to Nona and Grandpa's house. The house was big, so my room was right on the other side of the house from Nona and Grandpa's, and there was a bathroom a couple of rooms down from mine, and I think the room in between was a closet of some kind, and that's where I'd go if I needed a drink in the night. And that one night, I needed a drink really bad and also needed to pee really bad, and the nightmare combination when you really don't want to get out of your warm bed on a cold night. Now, eventually I braved it and stepped out into the corridor, and I was surprised to see a figure further down the hallway, because Nona and Grandpa rarely came around this part of the house, and certainly not at 2 in the morning. Assuming it was one of them, I called out, and the figure turned. He was dressed in some kind of military garb, like a soldier's, but for some reason it was entirely white. His face was also incredibly pale, and so was his hair, and I wasn't dumb enough to fail to realize that I was looking at a ghost. Now, assuming that I was still in bed and this was a dream, I decided to play along. I asked the ghost who he was as he strode towards me. Now, he looked to be in his late 20s and had a very stern, angry look. He certainly had no intention of talking to me, and instead, he screamed at me that he was my grandpa from before, and that children shouldn't be wandering around the halls, especially late at night, and to get back to bed immediately or I'd get the belt. Dream or not, I ran straight back to my room. I'm not ashamed to admit that I pulled a chair over and stood on it and pissed in the sink. And the water from this sink wasn't drinking water, so I never did get my drink, and suddenly I was overcome with this crazy fatigue, so I dragged myself back to bed, and the next thing I knew, it was mid-morning. Now, that was a pretty messed up dream, I told myself. I had no grandpa from before, obviously, and I'd learned a long time ago that nobody wants to hear about your goddamn dreams. Seriously, if you ever want to bore someone, tell them about a dream that you had in detail. And therefore, I never mentioned the incident to anyone and continued to have a great summer until eventually I had to go home to discover my parents now hated each other and my life was upended. And it was possible that I might not be allowed to stay with my dad. And the whole thing was a mess that I don't want to go into, but it somewhat sorted itself out eventually. Now, I'm glad that I was still able to have a relationship with my father because it was when he was an older man that I found out a very chilling truth. Apparently, Grandpa wasn't actually his biological dad. My father was the youngest of the 3 siblings, so he'd only been a couple of months old when his biological dad died, and he never really knew him. But my dad, my uncle, and my aunt were all actually adopted by my grandpa, who passed by then, and they never spoke of their biological father. According to my dad, my bio-grandpa died in some conflict while serving in the army, and due to the kind of abusive, unpleasant man he'd been, Nona moved on really quick. Some say that maybe Grandpa may have been on the scene before Grandpa number 1 passed, but who knows. Dad told me that he had a few photos of Grandpa number 1 that he managed to salvage, photos of him in his military gear and whatever conflict he'd served in, Desert Storm or something like that, and he asked if I wanted to see them. Now, I thought back to the figure that I'd seen that night, the one that I dismissed as a dream. I thought about how he said that he was my grandpa from before, and how much he sounded like this horrible man who'd been my own dad's biological father. Maybe it was a mistake, but I told Dad that I didn't want to see the photos, that I was quite happy continuing to see Grandpa number 2 as my grandfather, and that seeing the photos might diminish his memory, and I think my dad was relieved. In truth, the idea that the man in the photos might look identical to the figure I supposedly dreamed about that night was just too much to take. What would you have done? Would you have satisfied your curiosity? Or would you have been content to continue convincing yourself that it was just a dream, and spectral Grandpa number 1 was just that, an imaginary specter? When she was a kid, my cousin used to live some distance away from a mental rehab facility, aka an insane asylum. There was a building much closer to her house that had been condemned for as long as I could remember and had always been locked up. Rumor had it that there was this ward that used to house the most dangerous patients, and it got closed down when they built houses around there, and I have no idea if this was true or not, honestly. Now anyways, when I was a teenager and my cousin was a bit younger, whoever owned the mental hospital overall decided that they were finally going to knock down this one building, which was a huge distance from the hospital itself. And this meant construction workers would be moving in soon, and so we decided this was our last chance to actually go and explore the outside of this 3-story building, and it was kind of the size of 3 houses and post-Victorian if I had to guess. And so we headed over there with my cousin Jessica's 2 dogs, Floss and Billy. Now they weren't purebred or big tough animals or anything like that, but they were pretty brave dogs. They accompanied us to the side of the building, and that's when we discovered that, for the first time ever, the padlock closing this supposed insane asylum had been left unlocked. Now naturally, we took the padlock off and opened the side door. Literally within seconds, both of the dogs pulled out of our hands, and now they were on leashes, and went running back across the field to my cousin's house. We tried calling for them because they were normally super obedient, but they were absolutely not coming back to us. Now we were both kind of babies about going in too far, plus the boarded up windows made it hard to see, and neither of us geniuses had thought to actually bring some flashlights. And there was enough light to see though, but barely. In the side hallway, we found this little chalkboard with some odd writing on it. It's hard to tell if it was something a patient had written or a doctor or a nurse with terrible handwriting. If you've ever dealt with doctors in particular, you'll understand. Now, the words were kind of gibberish, something about mother and other things I forget, which makes me suspect that they'd been written by a patient. My cousin claimed that she heard a noise coming down the end of the hallway, and we looked and there was nothing, just a completely empty area. Now next, we went into one of the side rooms, and there was broken glass all over the floor, so we had to be careful, and a mattress in one corner. I have no idea why these things were still there when, as far as I knew, the building had been closed for well over a decade. My cousin didn't want to stay in the side room for long because this one was almost pitch dark and with barely any sunlight coming through the boards that covered up the window, and so she went out into the corridor and immediately called me to come look. I joined her and saw what she was pointing to. One of those plastic chairs, the kind you use in schools or hospitals for therapy sessions, was now sitting far down the corridor in what seemed to be the foyer of the building. 100% the chair had not been there before we'd gone into the room, and I would swear on it. Our immediate thought was that the builders had arrived early, even though there was absolutely no indication of this, and so we just ran back out the side door and headed home across the field. Now, I would dismiss this all as nothing, but both of us would swear on our graves that as we ran back to my cousin's house and glanced over our shoulders, there was a face looking out of a hole in one of the upper boards. This definitely wasn't a construction worker, and the central staircase had collapsed and there was currently no way to access that second floor. Nobody should or could have possibly been up there. Now, we bring it up occasionally as a cool possible ghost story we experience, and as a side note, my cousin's mom passed away a few years ago, and for a long time, and spanning 2 different countries, my cousin kept seeing a blue butterfly flitting around her. Apparently some people believe a recurring blue butterfly is the sign of a soul checking on a loved one. I don't know if I believed in all of this, but I do know that between the face in the window and the blue butterfly, my cousin seems to potentially attract the paranormal. But I'd love to believe, is this real? So, I'm just a normal guy living in the Pacific Northwest. I have 2 dogs and I often hike around in the spring and summer days. There is a particular hike that I like to do with my dogs because the trail is along a river and they love to swim, and it's one of those trails that no one really knows about. I've been hiking it for about 6 years now, and I've never seen another person out there. One of my dogs is reactive, so having a place where I never have to worry about running into another person or dog is perfect for me. April of last year, I loaded my dogs up and drove us to the trailhead. we got out and started hiking around. About 2 miles in, I come across a tree that someone had used red rope and large nails to tie up what I think is a cow's tongue. Just nailed it to a tree. The tongue itself was tied tightly or bound with rope, and then they used big nails to nail it to a tree. There were 2 of them on one tree, and next to the tree in the river water, there was large, again assuming cow, bones just scattered. And the dogs definitely started to act different. They seemed very uneasy. I looked around a bit to see if anyone was out there or if there was someone who was maybe homeless and had found camp there. But there was nothing around and no signs of someone camping, no trash, no tent or fire. And my dogs kept tucking their tails in and would stop and look out as if something was near, but I couldn't see anything, and so I decided to turn back. Once we were fairly far away from that tree, the dogs started to loosen up again. And that night I couldn't stop thinking about it. A, it was all just very weird, and B, I had never once seen anyone out that way. It was one of those hikes where there's this bit of a hike to the trailhead, and then the trailhead doesn't look like a trailhead really, and the hike itself isn't very easy. It's rocky and wet, and it's worth it once you get about 3.5 miles in and you get a nice flat beach all to yourself. Now, I kept thinking about it every night for about a week, and then I decided to go back. I packed up my dogs, got ready for the hike, and when I got back, I couldn't find it. But not just the tongues, but the tree itself. I couldn't even find the tree where they were, and I was looking all over. The tree had a somewhat unique lean to it, but I couldn't find it, and I felt around in the trees looking for the nail holes, but nothing. Now, I tried to look up what this could be online, and all I could find was maybe witchcraft or satanic spells. And in short, it seemed like some kind of ritual to keep spirits or people quiet. I'm not sure if this story exactly fits here at the sub, but I'm just so curious to know if anyone is familiar about this. I did attach some pictures that you can see now. To start the story, I just want to say that I saw what I saw. I don't care if people don't believe me, and my sister saw it too, and many people in my area have said that they've seen the same thing. Now, I just want to share my experience, and if you don't like it, I don't care. So, back when I lived in Nevada, we lived in a manufactured home, or whatever you might call it, sort of like a double wide, but nicer. Now anyways, my sister and I had rooms directly across from each other. We both had windows facing the backyard, and one night I was standing in front of my vanity that had a mirror that was facing the window, and it was late at night. I saw a very tall man with a paper white head and no features skipping past my window. It moved very fast. I was only able to catch a brief glimpse, but for long enough that I could recognize these features. It was very skinny, tall, and dressed in all black, maybe a suit. Now terrified, I go into my sister's room and tell her what I saw. Now she says, "Oh God, that's scary," basically, and we go back to our rooms. And then my sister comes to my room wide-eyed and breathless and told me that she just saw the same thing. And then I saw it skip past my window one more time. My dad taught me from a young age, if that's all they do, they're weak. Don't let them put fear into you. Now, he would scream at things when I was a child like he was angry, but I don't let that stuff get to me. And also, the earth keeps spinning, I guess, so I just let it go. And frankly, I subconsciously thought that it was just my eyes seeing things, and we went about my life as usual. But I would bring it up sometimes in conversations with friends, and to my surprise, they've seen that creature as well, like apparently a lot of people around here. But I'm curious, has anyone honestly seen this thing too? Now, I call it Slender Man because that's kind of what fits the description, but I can't imagine it's truly that. Even though I never saw anything paranormal in the direct way many people claim to, like clearly seeing, hearing, or feeling things, this specific experience left a mark on me nonetheless. I'll keep it brief because I don't want my post to get taken down, and when I was little, my bedroom was in a somewhat isolated part of the house. Right next to it, there was a smaller room, the laundry room, that didn't have a door. The darkness coming from there was terrifying, and to be honest, I've always been a bit of a fearful person, but I couldn't call myself a coward. Now that day, I was just watching Adventure Time on one of those old-school box-shaped TVs, not like the ones we have now. And I remember I was watching the episode with the Lemonhead guy, Lemon Grab, I think. And eventually, I decided to turn off the TV, which would be a normal thing for anyone else. But that night would trigger a trauma that stays with me to this day. As soon as I turned off the TV and laid down, I hadn't even had my eyes closed for 2 minutes when a woman's face appeared right in front of me. It scared me so bad that I snapped my eyes open and jumped out of bed immediately. I ran out of the room and luckily ran into my dad in the hallway. I told him I wanted to sleep with him, and the rest of the night went by normally and nothing like that ever happened again. Now the face was, from what I remember, white and completely expressionless. Everything around it was pitch black, and it was as if this pale face just emerged from the void. However, it only happened while my eyes were closed, and to this day, more than 8 years later, I cannot sleep without some kind of light or background noise. Now what I do is set a sleep timer on my television, and it stays on for a few minutes while I drift off and then shuts down automatically. I know it sounds crazy or hard to believe, but that's how it happened. I never had another experience like it, and by the way, in that house, my dad supposedly felt his bed being moved. And apparently, the original owner's wife died in the room my dad was sleeping in. Now, I attached a reference image, and the face I saw didn't have such a terrifying smile, it simply had no expression at all. But I want to reiterate that this image is only for reference, just to give you an idea, and this happened many years ago, and I hope I can get some feedback here. So this just happened a couple of hours ago, and I'm pretty freaking shook, not gonna lie. So I bartend at a dive bar in a pretty terrible part of San Francisco, Soma for those of you who know. Now, I was doing my usual chain smoking, nightcap, catching up on some text messages that I missed when I heard some glassware rattling in the kitchen, which is only like 30-ish feet away from where I was sitting at the bar, and so it was very obvious and loud. Now, at first, I thought it was maybe a rat or something, or at worst, a crackhead that snuck their way in while I wasn't paying attention. But the second I stepped into the kitchen to check it out, I heard the same exact rattling sound coming from the bar which I had just been sitting at, but hella louder and way more aggressive. So I pulled my knife out, still thinking it was some homeless guy or a crackhead or something, but the exact second I walked back into the bar area, I got hit with this huge wave of goosebumps. The temperature dropped. I was shivering. All of my hairs were standing up, and I had this feeling that you get when you know somebody is watching you. No, there was nobody in the building except me. I quadruple checked every square inch of the place, and it's not like a huge bar, it's actually quite small. Now, once that happened, I just knew that we are not alone out here. So the Bell Witch case might be the most documented haunting in American history. A future president got involved and left terrified. So in 1817, the Bell family in Tennessee started experiencing things they couldn't explain. Knocking sounds on the walls, bed covers being pulled off at night, and a faint voice that got louder over time. The voice could quote scripture, sing hymns, and eventually started addressing family members by name. It hated John Bell specifically. It said it would kill him. Now the story spread, and in 1819, General Andrew Jackson traveled from Nashville to investigate. According to multiple accounts, his wagon froze on a dry road and couldn't be moved no matter how hard his men pushed. Jackson reportedly said, "By the eternal boys, this must be the witch." Now a voice from the woods replied, "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you tonight." Now his men were so shaken after one night that they left the next day. Jackson is quoted as saying that he'd rather face the entire British Army than spend another night with the Bell Witch. In 1820, John Bell died under very strange circumstances. A vial of dark liquid was found in the house, and the family tested it on a cat, which died instantly, and the voice claimed that she poisoned him. What makes this case unusual is the amount of documentation. There are named witnesses, dates, and written accounts from people who were there. Most hauntings from this era are vague stories passed down with no names attached, and this one has a real paper trail. The Bell Witch Cave in Adams, Tennessee is on the National Historical Registry and is still open to visitors today. I was just minding my business, rewatching Game of Thrones, loving life, and I heard a weird noise. I looked around and realized that it was coming from my phone. I picked it up and held it to my ear, and I heard what sounded like labored breathing and footsteps in snow. Now, at first, I thought something was just playing in the background. I looked through all my open apps, and there was nothing that would be playing sound, and I force-closed all the apps, and the sound persisted. Another weird thing about it was that my volume was in the middle. I turned it up and turned it down, and there was no change. Just a low breathing and these snowy footsteps. It didn't sound like a loop either, and the breathing was pretty inconsistent. I restarted my phone, and the sound went away. Like 5 minutes later, I got that feeling in my mouth like I was going to puke, and I did. Violently. And then I felt fine. It just came out of nowhere. I don't ever just throw up for no reason, so in my head, I'm connecting to whatever was going on with my phone. I don't know if this is related, and I kind of brushed it off until now, but the other night I was walking my dog, and I was getting closer to my house, and I heard footsteps behind me. I instinctually turned around to see who it was, but no one was there, and my dog also turned around and looked alert. Now, I'm just kind of weirded out right now. Maybe there is a logical explanation for everything, but I can't seem to think of a good one. Something unusual has been happening, and I'm not sure what to make of it. Maybe someone here can offer some explanations. And to give you the full picture, we used to live in the city, but we got tired of the noise and the prices, so we moved out of Brooklyn a little over 2 years ago and into a quiet little area about 2 hours from the city, bordering alongside Pennsylvania. Now, we're not very familiar with rural life, so it's still a bit new to us. My house sits on the edge of the woods, and we don't have neighbors on that side, just trees stretching for miles and miles. Now, in winter, I move my workspace to the living room by the wood stove, sitting next to a large window that looks out over the terrace and the forest. Now, I keep the blinds closed to hold in the heat. 2 nights ago, I was working on my spicy horror story when I suddenly heard what felt like a loud bang, like something heavy had fallen. I thought it came from the basement, but it could also be outside, so I ignored it. A little later, the bang repeated, and this time louder and closer. I felt the vibrations in the floors and the walls, like someone was just outside, either on the terrace or under it, hitting the wall right next to me. Now, I got scared and decided not to open the blinds and instead just go to bed. But as I was getting under the blanket, not even a minute later, the bang happened again, just as loud and just as close as the second time. Someone or something was right outside our house. I woke up my partner, told him what happened, and asked him to go check with me. We checked the terrace, but there was no one, and the rest of the night was quiet. The next night, around 9 o'clock, it was very dark out as we don't have any streetlights in my area, and he went outside to grab wood from the backyard pile for the fire stove so the house would stay warm throughout the night. I stayed inside, music playing, running around to feed the pets, and when he returned, he asked if I had heard anything. I hadn't. He said there had been a very loud, powerful bang that made the ground tremble coming from the woods. Of course, it might have been a tree falling, but there was no cracking, no rustle of breaking branches, only a sudden bang, and needless to say, we decided not to investigate. And now it's morning, and I can't help but feel a little anxious about whether it might happen again tonight. But what do you think it might be? So a little background info before the actual paranormal speculation. I got my girl 5 years ago. She's 9 now and the pride of my life. And this picture above is my cat, Beatrix. Now, we actually have 2 cats. We had only planned on getting one, but we fell in love with both. When adopting Beatrix, we were told a bit about her past, and she has a history of seizures and certain allergies, but has been returned 4 times, each time within a month. We speculate that it's probably due to her seizures, but she has them very infrequently and they're not that difficult to deal with. Now, with the actual speculation, right after we got her, she immediately started roaming the house. She's a very curious kitty and we love her for that, and the layout of my house is as such. We have 2 floors, the basement is relatively unused, but we keep the cat's litter boxes and food down there. In the upstairs, we have a large space with the kitchen, dining room, and the living room. Attached to the dining room is a large sliding glass door that leads out onto a back porch, and then we have a long hallway with a few rooms attached. The bathroom, my mom's room, my mom's office, and then a spare room. The interesting thing about that spare room is that I used to sleep in it. From ages 0 to 10, that was my bedroom, but I suffered from extreme night terrors, and I could never get a good night's rest in that room, so I moved into a different room, and the nightmares stopped immediately. Now back to my cat. Beatrix explored the entire house, and I kind of followed her around while she did so. She got to that spare room and immediately started hissing, and didn't stop until I closed the door. Well, that was weird. Now, throughout these 5 years, she has refused to step foot into that room. My dog and other cats sometimes sleep in there, but Beatrix refuses. It was odd, but whatever. Now, after about a month of having her, we noticed that every night she had the same routine. She'd go back to the back sliding door and stare outside for about an hour, every night, and then she would explore the whole house like she was a warden or something, and then come into my room and cuddle for the rest of the night. It was kind of creepy, and at first we assumed that maybe she was interested in going outside. She likes to sunbathe and sit by our bay window, so we trained her to use a harness, and we took her outside, and she hated it, so we shrugged it off. Now, the next part is the weirdest part. It is a constant ongoing joke in my family that she is a portal jumper, and there are many, many instances where I'll walk into the living room to grab some water and see her on her cat bed, and then immediately walk back to my room and see her in my bed. This happens a lot, where you'll walk into one room and see her and then walk into another room and she's just there too. Cats have a reputation of being sneaky, but not that sneaky. And one time she even managed to get outside without us noticing, and we weren't sure how she does that. My mom and I were recently talking about all of this, and I told her that I think that she's genuinely paranormal or has some weird connections to the other side, and my mom agreed. We're both somewhat superstitious, and we have our handful of ghost stories and stuff, but we also try to be logical. All of this combined, plus the general consensus that cats are spiritual beings, has us very, very convinced. But what are your thoughts? The day that I become 100% a believer in the paranormal was when I went to the mall with my mother and sister. My mom stayed behind looking at some makeup in Macy's, and so my sister and I decided to head to Claire's, and as we were passing by a lounge area with tables and sofas, I got this feeling of being watched. I turned my head and locked eyes with a girl who I assumed was with a family at the lounge area because she was resting her arm on one of the ladies sitting on the couch. But the more I stared at the girl, the more creepy details I saw. She was pale and grinning with her mouth closed. She wore a white dress and her hair hung over the sides of her face, almost like The Grudge. She never blinked and just sort of stared at me. I finally stopped and turned to my sister to tell her if she sees that girl staring at me, and she goes, "What girl?" I pointed toward the couch where she had been, and now she was gone. I looked all around, and she was completely gone. The lady she had her hand on seemed to not even notice her missing, as if she never was even there. And the story is completely true, and that's why I believe in the paranormal. I swear on everything that this is a true story. This happened just a few weeks ago on Christmas Eve. This is December 24th, 2025, at my parents' house, and I've only changed the names for privacy. Now, for context, my brother, a 32-year-old male, is married to Amanda, a 33-year-old female. My mom wanted to bring the families together, so she invited Amanda's mother, Diana, and Amanda's sister, Isabella, to join us for dinner. Now, to organize the seating arrangements, my mom decided to be a bit formal and wrote everyone's names on little cards, placing them on the plates. She set it up so that my sister-in-law's mother, Diana, and her sister, Isabella, would be seated right next to each other. Now, here's where it gets weird. When my mom was writing the card for Isabella's seat, for some reason she still can't explain, she didn't write Isabella. Instead, she wrote the name Amber, and she just placed it on the table without realizing what she had done. When everyone went to sit down, Diane looked at the place sitting next to her and saw the name Amber on the card, and immediately burst into tears. It turns out that Diana had another daughter named Amber, who passed away tragically when she was only 5 or 6 years old. The thing is, nobody in my family knew this. We had no idea Amber ever existed, and my mom had absolutely no knowledge of this history. There was no way for her to have confused the names because she didn't know the name Amber to begin with, and we were all left in shock. Since there is no logical explanation for how my mom pulled that name out of thin air, we can't help but feel it was a sign, maybe a little nudge from a spirit to let her mom know that she was with us that night. Has anyone else ever experienced something like this? I know that everyone has had their fair share of weird experiences. I'm not panicking here, I just wanted thoughts and advice. I don't think I'm the chosen one or that I was abducted or something, just mildly concerned and interested. Now that said, I lost quite a bit of time last Monday. Now in the image you can see that I messaged my mom telling her that I was at Walmart waiting for her grocery pickup at 9 minutes past 4. Now I know I didn't wait more than 3 minutes because I was listening to the same song when the guy came out. She lives about 10 minutes from there and I drove straight there with minimal traffic, never stopped or stuck or anything. And when I arrived at their house, my parents were worried and asked if I was okay. Now I'm confused and said, "Yeah, why?" And they said, "We expected you here sooner." Now I, of course, said, "Well, I texted before I left Walmart," thinking that that would be the aha moment, with them, of course, seeing that I had texted them 15 minutes ago and saying, "Oh, duh, that's right," and we'd move on to making some soup. Now instead, Dad replies saying, "Yeah, that was an hour ago." Now still thinking that I'd price him wrong, I checked my watch, and to my surprise, it was 4:57. I was surprised. Figured that I must have left Walmart later than I expected, so I checked our texts and saw the timestamp. Now somehow I left Walmart at 10 after 4, and then 47 minutes later, I finished my 10-minute drive to their house. Again, I'm not panicked here. I didn't see little green men or demons or anything like that, but I don't know what happened. Now, what would you do? Should I be worried that I may or may